Chair. So this morning we're scheduled to work through agenda item 13, which is finance and administration. Now, noting that at the FAC you have received all of the finance and administration presentations and papers in full, and also noting our discussions around trying to streamline the process both with the FAC and the Commission itself. My intention is to simply bring those documents and presentations back up, and if you have any specific questions on them, we can certainly delve into those particular items and then hold discussions and budget modifications accordingly. Now, the first item in that order is the financial statement from 2018. And you'll recall that Mr. Larson presented paper 16 to you, and the presentation is on the screen at the moment. And it was simply essentially a summary of all of our financial income and expenditures throughout the financial year of 2018. And we're looking for you to, first of all, note that report in full and to approve the financial statement for financial year 2018 as detailed in paper 16. So, Chair, to expedite the process, we could either proceed for discussion to do that, or we could delve into details. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dave. I'll just see if there are any particular questions on fiscal year 2018 that people want to go back and ask questions about. Does anyone have any questions or comment on 2018? No one? You're all good? You're still looking, Chris, or thinking about something else? Oh. I'm not seeing it. Yeah, I think it would be good to have a motion and a seconder for each one of these as we go through them, Bob.
So I would make a motion to accept the 2018 financial updates.
I can second. All right, is anyone opposed? No opposition, Dave.
Thank you, Chair. The next agenda item then is the annual independent auditors reports for 2017 and 18. You'll recall that you have before you the independent auditors report for 2017, which is detailed in document 17. If you could bring that up, thank you. We at the FAC went through in general the key notings of the independent auditor for 2017. And are requesting that you note the report in full, approve the 2017 audit, while also noting that the 2018 audit is currently underway as of essentially yesterday. And we expect that the 2018 audit will be delivered in the coming months. And I'm hesitant to put a finger on that, noting that the 2016 and 17 audits have taken some time due to difficulties with the software transition that we've had that Mr. Larson articulated at the FAC. So just to clarify, at this point, we're looking for an approval of the 2017 audit report. In addition to that, we have the endorsement of the reappointment of the current auditor, noting that they've changed company names and partnerships, and so by nature we have to reaccredit or reauthorize their services as a different company for the coming year, as Mr. Larson indicated at the FAC. And then to recall that due to those software issues that we had throughout 2017 is the reason why the 2017 audit is late, and also why now the 2018 audit is only just commencing. With that, I will pass back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So just remind the Commission what the software issues were that you were experiencing.
Thank you, Chair. So it was partly as a result of a migration to a new software that we were using for accounting purposes. As a result of that transition, Mike has informed us that there were some errors in moving across, or lack thereof, of moving across of some elements within the budget. As a result, as we were working through with the auditor, he identified some deficiencies which required us to go back and look at that software and re-migrate some of that information from the previous software to the new accounting software. And so as a result, that has certainly taken Mike a little bit longer to verify that all of the information was accurately migrated from the two different software, from one to the other, and then for the auditor to be content with those migrations in undertaking his auditing process.
And so now the auditor is satisfied.
That's correct. Within the scope of the auditor's terms of reference and contract, which is and I've forgotten the specific financial terminology that's used, he undertakes a very specific set of auditing procedures. There are a number of auditing types that can be undertaken. You have the standard, which is what he has undertaken and is articulated in his terms of reference and contract. And then you have other types, such as a forensic audit, and he is not currently contracted to undertake that level of auditing.
And from your point of view, there's no need to do that?
Thank you, through the chair. I think it's one of those things that, as per other best practice, it's something we should consider periodically doing, just as we do, or we're talking about doing additional peer review of key research and scientific products, in addition to our standard review through the Scientific Review Board. I would consider that it would be best practice that periodically we deviate from it on the standard audit to undertaking a forensic audit. There's certainly no red flags that the auditor is identifying to require that at this point, but I think it's important that I communicate to you that it's, as part of best practice, it's something you may wish to consider requesting in the future. Thank you.
You're proposing like that would be a periodic, not a regular, though?
I think that's the case, Chair, yes.
Are there any questions on Bob?
What's the cost of our auditor on an annual basis?
Thank you, Chair. It's actually hard to put a finger on these last couple of years because he spent more time than he would normally do so. It's less than $10,000 to undertake the type of audit that we're looking at. And then it really depends on the type of issues that are identified. And in this case, because we had these software issues, he spent more time than usual undertaking the standard audit. If we were to undertake a forensic audit, there would be additional costs involved, and we'd have to get quotes. I wouldn't like to go out on a limb unless any of you are familiar with forensic audits. Thank you, Chair.
Bob?
So I'll move approval of the 2017 audit that was completed the 20th of December 2018.
Is there a seconder? Neil? Any opposed? No opposition, Dave.
Thank you. And so the next required action is to endorse the reappointment of the current auditor, noting the transition to a new company as a sole operator. And that information was also provided in the paper. So we're looking for a motion to endorse the reappointment of MKD CPA PPLC as the auditor.
So given your previous comments, Dave, you're satisfied with the auditor, so.
That's correct. I'm very satisfied with the interactions I've had with the auditor, in addition to the auditing practices that he's been undertaking.
Is there someone that could make a motion?
I can make a motion to approve the auditor for continued work with the commission.
Any opposition? No, so carried. Bob?
Is the Halibut Commission required to file anything with IRS or?
Through the chair, in short, yes. We certainly have very specific requirements as an international organization. Essentially, we're IGO, and we have very specific codes that we need to respond to the IRS, yes.
I'll just add for tax purposes in the United States, we're a not-for-profit. That's how we account for it.
How's that, Steve?
Right. There are different tax rules if you're a for-profit or not-for-profit kind of organization. So charities and other organizations and things like us, that the portion of the tax code that accommodates us best is a not-for-profit.
All right, so next on the agenda is the budget for fiscal year. Let's see, what do we have here? Where's 2019? Have the 2020 estimates.
Through the chair, yes, you may recall that we moved in 2018 to project our budgets 2 years in advance, and now we're coming back to the 1 year in advance. And so the 2019 budget was approved at the previous annual meeting, and at the interim meeting last year, we simply notified you of some of the transitional elements that we made among budget lines in accordance with the financial rules, regulations rather. And so the FY19 budget was already approved. The 2020 budget is what we're looking at in terms of approval, and the 2021 is simply a notional budget, which you're just taking note of at this point. And so not wanting to go through the details again, unless you specifically request, I think recapping our FAC discussions, there is the outstanding discussion around the fishery economist to be had, and then any other additional elements that you may have considered or would like to raise regarding the 2020 budget. Thank you, Chair.
I see a couple hands up, Bob, then Chris.
So is the economist worked into this budget that where I'm saying the general account carryover goes to 434? Is that already, and is that spread over 2 years or 2.5 years or something like that?
Through the chair, yes. Thank you very much for the question. The answer is yes. If you may recall at the work meeting last year, you made a direct request for us to incorporate the likely costs for that position into the budgets and projections for 2020 and 21, so that you could consider it not only in terms of the role and responsibilities of that position, but also the financial impacts in terms of the drawdown on the carryover. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, Chris.
So do we, Dr. Wilson, Dave, do we need to answer that question first before we approve the broader budget? And was there also a discussion of a life science person that I never quite understood what exactly that was?
My understanding is I guess for fiscal year 2019, you've included a budget for the economist position of roughly 81,000. And then in the 2020 is included 142,000 and 21 is 62,000. So I think they're currently included, and I guess we need to decide whether we wish to expend those funds on the economist position or elsewhere. I think the question that you raised about a life history modeler, my recollection is, and Dave can correct me where I'm wrong, is about, I think it was a year ago or maybe a bit more at the Scientific Review Board, they proposed that a life history modeler would be, should be added to the suite of tasks for the IPHC, given what they were seeing in the 5-year research plan. I don't recall, I guess, Chris, that they actually we're specific in what that life history modeler would do. And so I think the way I was thinking about it anyhow was we needed to better understand what that was from the staff and from the SRB about what that person would do and how that would help us better understand with what's going on with halibut more generally. And so I was thinking that we as a commission would make a request to get a better understanding of what that position would do and how that would assist us. Yeah. And Chris?
Do we need that before we can approve the budget, or we can approve the budget and do that later?
I think we could still approve the 2020 budget and may wish to make a note that we've requested to have that undertaken, and we may not expend the funds or may modify and change them. Yeah. And then I think we've had a little bit of discussion around the economist and what they may or may not do, but I was also thinking maybe we wanted to have that discussion later this afternoon when we have a few other things to talk about and see what we want to do, or we could do it now, whatever your preference is. But
But we need to do the budget approval now, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
As with the other thing, we could do that and still have that discussion and go decide which direction to go with that.
Yes, that's my understanding, Chris. Yeah. Okay. Dave.
So just to provide a little bit more background in terms of the life history modeler, how the chair has summarized it is correct. And we have been working with the Scientific Review Board and our staff internally to develop a proposal which would include drafts, terms of reference, and a position description for a life history modeler. That document, the position description, etc., is currently in development, and we would like to be able to take that to the SRB for additional input. The SRB recommendation was naturally quite abbreviated in terms of requesting a life history modeler, and so we would like to be able to take specific projects and types of tasks to them for consideration that position may potentially undertake. And so specifically for the 2019 budget, which has already been approved, there would be no financial implication. And then if it was to be adopted for the 2020 budget, as we did at the last interim meeting, we would undertake a budget review and potentially modify the budget to incorporate that type of new position for a proportional element to be hired in 2020 or 2021 accordingly. Thank you, Chair.
Chris?
I think one last question. So if we approve this budget and then later on today we were to decide not to move forward on the economist thing, what would be the impact?
Through the chair, if you would like to go that route, it would be a matter of literally indicating your endorsement for the 2020 budget, and with the caveat and noting that the funds currently assigned for a fisheries economist may be redirected by the commission. And you could either just leave it open at this point until we close this meeting and it's redirected, and then you would state how, or redirected intersessionally as an intersessional decision. Thank you, Chair.
Richard?
So this economist position, the budget line item, is there a person that you have in mind that gave a quote that, to get this job done, or how did you come up with the salary for this position?
Thank you. Through the chair, the position is based on similar categories within the United States. For example, we've been looking at the recent fishery economist hire that the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council made. And so we looked at the relative scales, the roles and responsibilities of what we were looking to achieve versus that position description and other economist positions throughout the US, and calibrated that onto the general service salary scale. And so while the proposal says it's either going to be at that sort of 12 or 13 level on that scale, there's obviously scope to move within the budgeting element. Thank you.
Question for you, Dave, on the economist position. What do you see as the 3 major tasks that they will actually deliver in 2 years?
Thank you, Chair. What I might do is actually have Tom project the document that I circulated for the fishery economists, and then I can quickly highlight those for you. So this is I emailed it to you, Tom. I'm not sure if you received it or not. While you scramble to do that, I will highlight some of those elements. So in that document that I emailed to you, essentially we would like to undertake first of all, a recap of all of the social economic information that has been published related to the Pacific halibut fishery. So that's simply a survey of previous studies and existing information to see what that known information is. And really to develop a comprehensive qualitative structural description of the current economics of the resource, encompassing all directed Pacific halibut fishery sectors. That would obviously include commercial, recreational, subsistence, ceremonial, and research. And then as per your tentative consideration of whether you would like us to also incorporate the bycatch components. If you recall back, there was also a proposal by the Commission some years ago to undertake an economic study of essentially hook to plate scenario. And so what we would like to see that position do is to fulfill that request by developing a quantitative analysis of the economic value and impact of all sectors of the directed halibut fishery, from the hook to the retail or end user level. And so that would certainly incorporate all elements such as recreational subsistence, noting that the bycatch generally doesn't reach the plate. That would be a different consideration. And finally, I guess as a fourth element is detail the geography of each sector's economic footprint, from the effect on local, regional, and national economy scales. So those are sort of a summary of those 4 key elements that I'd like to see delivered. There's a number of others that are listed in that document, but I think it's relatively self-explanatory. Thank you.
Chris?
Just a specific point on this, and I had a sidebar with Dave on this, that it very specifically says all directed halibut fishery sectors there on the first page. But then later on in that document, I believe it's page 7, where it sort of restates that paragraph, it includes the word bycatch sector. And I originally had thought if we're going to do a comprehensive economic evaluation of the use of halibut, that the sector, the bycatch sector, is a legitimate user of halibut and should be included. However, I've been convinced by my fellow commissioners on this side of the table that that's probably something that we should take out of this and not include that. But I just want to be specific. I don't want it to be confusing to folks. I think if we're going to go the route of focusing on the directed fisheries, there was maybe one edit that would need to be made on page 7 to delete reference to bycatch.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Richard?
Yeah, what's your feeling regarding the probability of accomplishing these goals in that period of time? I mean, it seems to me like a very high mandate for that. I mean, I wish all those things could be done, but could it be done realistically within that budget in that 2 years?
Thank you. And through the chair, so as a little bit of background, when the initial hook to plate concept was proposed by commissioners and passed to the Secretariat, we developed, and Steve will know the precise year, but it was developed and put out for tender to obtain essentially quotations and estimates of duration, the time it would need, and the resources it would take to complete the study. The tenders that were provided indicated, I think, a budget of about $350,000 to achieve that work. within a time frame, and Steve's going to have to chime in here in terms of the time frame of delivery, but it was certainly less than the 2 years that we're currently proposing. So for this proposal, we're indicating a 2-year period for that work with additional work at about $100,000 less in cost. And so I think the advantage, the short answer to your question is yes, I do think it's feasible to provide this analysis. There will certainly be uncertainties and limitations in terms of the economic information that's available for some of these sectors. But in terms of delivery, I'm confident that we would have a very useful product at the end of that 2 years or sooner. Thank you, Chair.
Bob?
So when you hire someone like this, do you put benchmarks or, like every 6 months, or every a certain amount of time, some deliverable has to be presented or accomplished? To kind of follow up on Richard's question.
Yes, through the chair. The short answer is yes. And 2 examples of that are our recent hires for the management strategy evaluation work. We hired Dr. Stephen Barukoff to undertake MSc programming in support of Dr. Hicks's work. And we've also contracted Dr. Pierre Carpi for a 2-year contract, similarly, again, to provide very specific inputs with specific timelines into the MSc work. And that was part of her employment contract. And is also part of her requirements to meet, for example, specific deadlines in terms of probationary period and then performance metrics along the way. And for all staff, we have a very detailed now annual performance evaluation, goal setting, and deliverable schedule that needs to be reviewed and kept up with. Thank you, Chair.
Any other questions or comments on this particular topic? Peter?
Do you see this as more, them working with other staff as well, possibly the MSAB or other directions as well, or is this specific to one study?
Through the chair, I see it as working with staff. Anybody we hire needs to be working in that multi-task, multi-department format. And so included in the terms of reference is not only this hook to plate study that would be undertaken, but also indications of that staff member would need to work, for example, with the MSAB, who have already started to talk about some of the economic implications of the MSE and taking that into consideration when developing goals and objectives, goals and fishery objectives, for example. We have spoke the MSAB and then also internally staff have spoken about maximum economic yield as potential objectives for different sectors. And that's certainly already taking place in the decisions that you make. And so in short, yes, that position would also work across branches, assisting by providing additional economic background and information on potential work, research, and decisions that could be made. Thank you.
Thank you.
One last question from me is, do you have any examples? I noticed in your paper you referenced 4 or 5 studies, but what you're proposing, as I see it, Dave, is to do one of the key tasks is to do evaluation across commercial, recreational, subsistence, and try to put a value on all of those pieces, an economic value. And so far I've not really seen, I would say, a study that has done that. And so this to me would be a challenge, particularly I would say on the subsistence piece. And then secondly, on the recreational, to a lesser degree, there's different ways of doing evaluation. And so I guess so more of a comment. And so I have a suggestion for the commission at this point in time. I would make a motion that we adopt the 2020 budget, that we will receive a report from the Secretariat on the life history modeler. I guess that would be discussed at the June meeting. And then provide us some feedback on what that position could or couldn't do. And then, so I make that motion to approve the 2020, but I'd also say that maybe we'd have a short discussion sometime today among the commissioners. And if there's no change, well, then that's the budget's approved. And if we had any further direction, we would let you know.
Second.
Any opposed?
Thank you. That's recorded. To answer your question in terms of the types of studies or examples of other work that's been undertaken, what I would suggest as part of that correspondence, we provide those to you. There are certainly fishery economic studies that have been done, including in Washington, for example, on the subsistence sectors. And so this position would really be taking those that are already in existence and then looking at those subsistence fisheries where that information has not yet been examined, and then collating those across all sectors. And so you would have the subsistence, recreational, commercial sectors, and then it would be the fishery economic analysis across sectors. So in a way, you're looking at individual silos in terms of the relative fishery economic importance of those sectors, and then across the range of sectors which are harvesting Pacific halibut. And then to seek clarification to the motion that was just made, you indicated that you're adopting the 2020 budget. You would like to see the life history modeler proposal as soon as available. And in that motion, you didn't include a specific indication about the fishery economist. So is that you just want to hold that off until this afternoon?
I'm saying that it would be included in the 2020 budget, and unless you hear from us otherwise, it would be included.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. And so the next item is simply the 2021 budget. And as previously indicated, we're simply asking for you to note that. So there's no particular motion that needs to be made. It's relatively, it's very tentative at this point, primarily because we're aiming to undertake a full rationalization of the fishery independent survey. And so the numbers that are currently in there for the supplemental budget line are very notional at this point. And so simply asking you to note that budget at this time. And with the overall goal of revenue neutrality. Yes, thanks, Dave. The next item is agenda item 13.4, which was the IPHC financial regulations. And as you may recall, Mike presented those at the FAC. They are very minor in nature, and all of those amendments were proposed by our auditor to bring us in line with the relevant financial requirements of the Commission. And so rather than skip through that red line, I would simply ask if there are any amendments or improvements that you would like to see made, or whether you would like to endorse those revised rules of financial regulations and ask the Secretariat to finalize and publish them as soon as possible. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Dave. I'll ask the commissioners if they would like to go through them, or they are satisfied with the proposals that have come from the auditor to make the adjustments to the financial regulations. So any commissioners would like to go through the Bob?
Just to clarify, the comments in blue are the auditor's recommended changes?
So there's, excuse me. So the edits are those that how we've interpreted the auditor's comments to us. There are certainly just some general administrative edits in there, which are certainly not the auditor's suggested edits, but the specific section, which I think starts on about page 11 from memory, details a few key elements that will bring us in line with the financial requirements for the Commission. I'll just bring those up quickly.
And if
Mr.
I,
Mr. Chair,
Yes,
could we
Bob.
have Dr. Wilson explain what 6 is, VI? Or I don't know if Mr. Larson's around, or Steve can answer it.
I can take a try at it. Mr. Chair, Commissioner Ellison, the most of these changes are suggested by new standards for not-for-profit organizations by the professional accounting organization in the United States. So all of these have to do with that. And there's basically three kind of changes which Mr. Larson detailed in the paper that accompanies this, that talk about the kind of reporting that you do. And so they're really, they actually make no changes in the way that we do our accounting. It's just simply a matter of, most of it is a matter of reporting what we have and how we, where we put this number and where we put that number. So they're all really quite minor, but they allow us to conform to the professional standard for not-for-profits in the United States.
Thanks, Steve. Any other questions? So we need a motion to approve these changes. Does anyone make that motion?
Make a motion to approve the changes.
Yeah, seconder?
I'll second.
Any opposition? It's passed unanimously.
Thank you, Chair. The only remaining item for Finance Administration is 13.5, which is revision to the IPHC Rules of Procedure. And so at the FAC, you'll recall that I highlighted the changes that have been proposed, which primarily revolve around adding a code of conduct for members of the Commission's subsidiary bodies, and then also some clarifications to separate the roles and responsibilities primarily of the Research Advisory Board and the Scientific Review Board, but in doing so also discussing with the MSAB their roles, responsibilities and reporting. And at this meeting over the period yesterday, to discuss with the Processor Advisory Board and the Conference Board the additional amendments. And the amendments to their rules of procedure revolve around obviously the addition of the code of conduct, but then essentially just the reporting requirements and how the decisions are reflected in the meeting report, how they're conveyed to commissioners to ensure that minority opinions are also accurately recorded and reported. So I can report back to you in terms of the Processor Advisory Board. They have general agreement in principle for the amendments that have been proposed to their rules of procedure. They requested that they be given overnight and this morning to ensure that all members are content with those modifications. And I expect to hear back from the Processor Advisory Board co-chairs at some point today with any final statement of endorsement or endorsement and modification, further modification. The Conference Board had no particular issues with the general edits that were included, the structural edits. However, we had a lengthy discussion around some of the additional clarifications that were provided around the roles and responsibilities. And the Conference Board was hesitant at this point to make some of the edits that were highlighted in the rules of procedure. And I indicated to them that the best way to proceed is for an intersessional working group, small working group of Conference Board members to consider those elements in detail and to provide feedback to us intersessionally. And so they are still considering some of those elements. And again, I'll hear back a little bit more today and we'll be able to report back to you most likely tomorrow morning at some stage. But most likely how I would propose proceeding is for those elements to be taken out, to be reversed if they're uncomfortable with them, and allow them time intersessionally to consider those few elements. And so that's the most likely outcome of what I'll propose to you as a Rev 1 tomorrow morning. In addition to that, and not incorporated in this round of modifications, was discussion about the accreditation procedure and representation on the conference board. As you're aware, the conference board is a very large creature in nature. I think there's 78 members sitting in there, have been accredited for this meeting. And in my discussions with the co-chairs prior to the conference board meeting and leading up to the annual meeting, there's general agreement that that needs to be rationalized. So I broached that at the conference board meeting, and again, there was general, as much as you can get general agreement and nodding around the table, that they recognize that it's an issue and would specifically like that to be addressed as part of this intersessional working group. And so the intention is that Secretariat will work with the chairs and the conference board subgroup between now and the next annual meeting and come up with proposed further additions to the rules of procedure surrounding the accreditation procedure for the conference board. Thank you, Chair.
Bob?
So I don't know if it was the beginning of this meeting or another meeting we had, but the focus of my first comment is with regards to the scholarship committee. I know that I thought I heard you say it's not really a committee by definition or whatever. So I'm just wondering what happened to it. It's no longer in this. And so how does that get handled in the future?
Thank you, through the chair. Yes, that's correct. So if you recall at the interim meeting, I highlighted the issue that we have these formal subsidiary bodies of the commission with various officers, roles, responsibilities, and reporting mechanisms. And then we have what's termed the scholarship committee. And probably it's a misnaming in many ways, is that it's certainly a small working group of commissioners and additional individuals, representatives of various sectors who get together and review the applications for the scholarships, IPHC Scholarship Fund, and then make an advice to the Secretariat. And I guess that's the key difference, is that this is coming as a recommendation from this small working group to the Secretariat. And then in the current terms of reference for that group, the Secretariat, so my position endorses that scholarship. And so as such, it doesn't actually fit within the definition of a commission subsidiary body, as it's not providing a recommendation to the commission for decision. That said, it is still a very important group, informal group, and it would continue to review the applications for the IPHC scholarship every 2 years, which is the current scholarship periodicity. Thank you.
So what, maybe I missed it, Dave, but who is the current membership?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The current membership is Commissioner Alverson and Peggy Parker and Chris Spohr. And then they work with us. Kelly Chapman of our staff coordinates it, and I coordinated the committee.
Bob?
Originally, I was a member of the conference board, and Chris Spohr was also a member of the conference board. We were put on that to represent industry viewpoints or participation. Peggy Parker from the processors, and there was Ralph Ford, who was a commissioner, also a processor, that was on, and then I got appointed here, and but I stayed on, and Ralph dropped off. But there, I recall that there was an interest to have people from industry, from the conference board and PAG and the commission involved. I know we had one of the First Nation people, I can't remember his name, was a commissioner a while back.
Maybe Cliff.
Yeah, Cliff. And so is that envisioned to be changed, or how? I don't even know how the commission selects those people anymore. It's just been a committee that's been standing for quite a long time.
Through the chair, Commissioner Alverson. Yes, the committee was invited by the executive director to participate, and it has been constituted to include a commissioner, a processor, and someone from conference board. And we certainly see that continuing in that manner.
Yeah, Bob.
The conference board members have put together an ad hoc committee to address some of these rules of procedure relative to the conference board, maybe PAG, I'm not sure what they're doing. So they have told me in the hall, but they haven't given a formal report, that they may ask the commissioners to stand down and taking any formal action at this meeting and wait till next year before we do something relative to the conference board and PAG. I just relay that to the chair, that I picked that up. Maybe you've picked it up as well.
This is on the rules of procedure.
Yes, are we not there? Yeah, it's on the rules of procedure. Yeah. And then I heard heard David make a comment about the size of the conference board and maybe whittling it down. I'm not sure that's where, I think that's where it was suggested to be done. I was a little bit surprised to hear that conference board people were willing to do that. I know agency people are aghast at that conference board when they look at it. As someone who's chaired it for almost 35 years, it's the mob, and it's more organized than it appears, and it's more efficient than it appears. There's usually about 6 to 8 people that take up 98% of the discussion, even though there's 78 groups sitting around. And I've always seen it as anybody can come and attend from a small organization and sit at the table and participate. And that participation, I think, is really powerful overall, and to have that support. So I'm not sure I'm supportive of whittling it down without a really good discussion from the conference board members at this time.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. And my understanding is the same as yours. And I think that's what Dave was saying, is that we will get a revision to parts of the rules procedure, but there will be more that will come once the conference board provides feedback intersessionally. And I'm not quite sure what the time frame of that is, but Dave, you said we would be considering this again for approval probably at the next annual meeting. And so, and the PAG decides to do the same, I would say it would be on that same time frame. So I think your points are, I agree with them, and I think we need to hear back from them about what they would like to do and see how they like to see it unfold. And so I'm glad to see that they have taken this on and will consider it and provide feedback. I guess on the scholarship one, just to close that out too, I'd ask the commission if they are satisfied with the current makeup, which is a commissioner, a conference board, and a PAG member, and staff. And I guess, Dave, you're making the distinction this does not report to the commission, but a decision is made among those people for scholarships, and that's why you're taking it out of the rules of procedure.
Yes, through the chair. Essentially, it's a review panel for effectively a job application, so to speak. So it's not a subsidiary body of the commission.
Right. So I'm comfortable with that. I don't, just providing my comments now. And I do think my question is then to the commissioner, are they satisfied with that makeup, and then providing direction for who the scholarships go to. And I would then also recommend, and I'm sure we'll have periodic review of how the scholarships are awarded. And I think that to me is satisfactory. I guess that's kind of very long motion. But is there any discussion, Rand? Bob?
Through the chair. So two elements. In terms of the reporting out from that committee, we would do that at each of the commission's meetings. So obviously at the work meeting, if the decision's made, or the interim meeting and the annual meeting, as we've done at this meeting. And then in terms of the makeup and the terms of reference of that panel, that's just something that's kept on file at the Secretariat and is available to the Commission at any point in time for review, if necessary, and revision. It's, as I said, essentially, it's a description of a makeup of a selection panel, which would fit with all of our other requirements for selection panel hiring elements for other positions at the IPHC.
To follow up, I guess I'm fine. Okay.
Steve?
Just to add to what the executive director was explaining about the committee, we reported on it in the report of the Secretariat, so that's where it appears in the documentation for the interim meeting and the annual meeting. And the other opportunity you have to review the operation of it is financially, because the scholarship fund is one of the separate funds that we maintain. It's detailed in the financial regulations, and we periodically report on how it's doing and what we're doing with that and how the money is spent. So you certainly have financial oversight of the scholarship itself.
Any other comments? No. So I can make a more succinct motion.
Can we make it maybe a couple to separate them out? I don't know, maybe a bit of a recap on what exactly, where have we landed here?
On the rules of procedure, we will not be adopting those at this point in time. We are awaiting updates from both Conference Board and PAG, and they will come back to the Commission at the annual meeting in 2020. On the scholarship fund, the proposal is to remove this from the rules of procedure and have a committee that has the composition of a commissioner, someone from the Conference Board, and PAG and a staff member that will make a recommendation to the executive director for a scholarship award. So basically no change in any of that procedure, Neil, but just that it's removed from the rules of procedure.
Okay, so it sounds to me like we are going to adopt some of the changes to the rules of procedure, but not others.
That is correct.
And through the chair, and just to facilitate that process, you will receive a Rev 1 version, most likely this evening or tomorrow morning, which will clearly articulate the edits to the rules of procedure that are everybody's agreed to, and then following the additional feedback from the Processor Advisory Board for which elements they are content with, and they've indicated to me while I was there that they are content with some of the modifications. And similarly for the Conference Board, they're content with some of the modifications that have been proposed, and others have been referred to this ad hoc working group that will occur intersessionally. And so we're looking to adopt a Rev 1 that you haven't seen yet tomorrow, and then next year, depending on this intersessional working group from the Conference Board, you may be looking at adopting additional modifications to their rules of procedure in terms of reference at next year's annual meeting. Thank you, Chair.
All right, thanks for that clarification, Dave. Are there any other questions about this? No. So that covers the agenda.
Thank you, Chair. So that closes out the Finance and Administration. We do have scheduled after lunch for the performance review and peer review elements. And so we have those two elements remaining today, which we could certainly take now. And in addition to that, noting that we circulated the draft report, there are a few elements that we'd like some Commissioner feedback on and potential agreement on how we move forward. So to recap, we have agenda item 14 on the peer review, the performance review, which includes the peer review elements, and some modifications that were circulated among Commissioners for potential agreement to move forward in the draft report. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. What would the commissioners like to do? Would you like to carry on with those particular sections at this point rather than coming back this afternoon? So it sounds like agreement to carry on with those particular items.
Thank
I
you, Chair.
noticed too, just there was on the agenda anyhow, there was public comment and questions. So on the section that we just covered, are there any public comments or questions?
Mr. Chair, there are nobody signed up for a public comment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Then through the chair. So agenda item 14, in particular 14.1, is an update on the second performance review of the IPHC. This is document 21, is currently on the screen. And this has not been updated since the interim meeting in terms of a discussion of where we're headed with the performance review. We still are planning to hold the 2 sessions within 2019 with the composition of that panel to be decided. We had some comments at the interim meeting regarding the NGO representation. And so what we're currently doing is looking at candidates to try and determine how many we would actually have. And we'll certainly pass that through commissioners intersessionally to confirm the makeup of that performance review panel. Everything else is simply based on the terms of reference that were adopted by the Commission at a previous meeting of the Commission itself. And we are still expecting to report out to you no later than at the 2020 annual meeting. Thank you, Chair. So it's simply asking for a noting of this paper.
Thank you, Dave. Are there any questions for staff on the paper? Bob?
So do agencies in general have performance reviews? I know this is our second. Are we going to have a third, or what is generally done in other agencies? And what does the staff envision for us?
Neil will cover that.
So we do get audited periodically in the department. I can tell you that. I don't know that there's a regularity to it, but over time, each program within the department and within the federal government more broadly will be the subject of an audit that examines how well it's delivering on its objectives and mandate. But I don't believe there's a defined periodicity to that.
I had a couple of things to that. There's internal people that do reviews. There's in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, there's a secretariat, if you will, that does periodic reviews of programs that are done under the direction generally of Parliament. They'll say, we'd like you to do something, or it could be under the deputy minister that says, review the Sum Audit Enhancement Program, for example. And then there's an external auditor general that will also quite frequently audit various aspects of the programs within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. But as Neil said, there's no, say, schedule of when those will happen. And when they happen, you have a very short period of time to turn around and do them. And so those ones are quite intense, and you have like sometimes 24 hours to provide information, and then they'll ask more questions. So, but I don't think there's, like you say, Neil, I'm not aware of any schedule. They happen and they show up in your inbox.
And thank you, Chair. And so to add from the international RFMO side of things, generally RFMOs undergo a peer review of this nature, a performance review rather, periodically, and the standard is set at around 5 years. It's certainly not set in stone, and it's very organizational specific. And noting that we've certainly passed that now by a couple of years, it's timely that the IPHC would undertake an additional performance review. I think the IPHC has undertaken some substantial progress to improve both the transparency and general engagement and representational nature of the organization over the last number of years. And it would certainly be a suitable time for a recalibration of those efforts to confirm or redirect those efforts in the next period. Thank you, Chair.
Neil?
Just a question, could you remind us of the plans for communicating out about the intention to undertake a performance review should we agree to it? How are you proposing that the plan and the process you're going to follow be communicated to PAG and to conference board, or more generally to the stakeholders?
Thank you, Chair. Through the Chair. I'm actually trying to open up the terms of reference, but it doesn't seem to be cooperating with this mouse, unfortunately. There we go. So as part of the terms of reference, criteria and process and associated budget to undertake the performance review, which you adopted a couple of annual meetings ago, it really talks about those specific elements in terms of what the makeup's going to be and how we intend on communicating that information. The idea of the performance review panel, though, is to act as an independent body to peer review those elements. And so in that sense, there is currently no intention for it to engage directly with the subsidiary bodies of the Commission. In a way, it's like an audit. It's an independent panel that will come in, review the information that's available and that's being published, and the recommendations, the structure, and how the Commission bases decisions. And that information will be synthesized against international best practice, and feedback, or rather additional information that's required, will be directed through the Commission and Secretariat. So for example, if the panel wanted direct feedback from the Processor Advisory Board, we'd facilitate that through the chairs and vice chairs of those bodies. That said, I don't envision that would actually be a role of the performance review panel. They will simply be looking at the whole range of criteria that are listed in that document and comparing our efforts and performance in a non-subjective way and reporting back to the Commission. Thank you, Chair.
Just clarification, that's helpful. I'm just wondering, are we, for example, in this annual meeting going to be letting people know about the process that will be undertaken? Is that part of the plan? Or how are we? That was my question, more not so much about how they're going to be involved, but what are we doing to let them know what will be happening?
Thank you, and through the Chair. A number of ways that we've been doing that is first of all through the Commission discussions over the last couple of years in adopting these terms of reference, noting of course that there's turnover and people forget what's been agreed to and done in the past. It's our intention to create regular informational dissemination avenues, whether that be through news releases, IPHC circulars, and most likely direct correspondence with the subsidiary bodies themselves. And so, for example, noting that we'll have the interim meeting in November of this year, we'll certainly be disseminating to the entire participant list to this annual meeting any progress that's being made throughout the year. But most notably, it'll be through the website and news releases and IPHC circulars. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions on this item? Peter.
So once the review is done, there will be a report generated and we will just get that's the direct feedback. Okay.
Through the Chair. And so that will be a two-step process. You'll receive an initial report with the intention not to redirect the efforts of the performance review panel, but rather to seek further clarification if necessary on its recommendations or draft recommendations. and then for those to be submitted to the annual meeting next year for potential endorsement. And you may recall that in the previous performance review panel report, there were a number of recommendations that from the panel that the Commission did not endorse very specifically. And so that's the role of the Commission at the end of the process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? So Dave, I noticed on the terms of reference, you have a chairperson, contracting parties, one representative, science advisor, external, RFMOs. Have all those positions now been filled?
Thank you, Chair. Through the Chair. We have tentative agreement to those, noting that we're trying to lock down the dates, as indicated at the interim meeting. I can't say that we have a fixed panel at this point. So we have individuals in mind from the contracting parties. We're having still some difficulty securing an NGO representative. And if that persists, we may well just ask for the Commission to agree that we are unable to, we've made attempts and been unable to fill that position and still move forward with the process. Thank you, Chair.
Well, since I guess the first meeting's not that far away, that seems kind of a likelihood. Do you want to have any feedback from the Commission right now? And that seems like you're going to need to make a decision pretty quickly, rather than trying to do this in a month.
Thank you, Chair. That would actually be appreciated. It would save an intersessional decision requirement. And so that something along the lines of a motion that should we be unable to secure an NGO representative on that panel within a week or two following the annual meeting, that the Commission endorses moving forward with the performance review without that position being filled. Thank you.
My recollection is that there was not that position on the previous performance review. Chris?
I was never sure of a compelling reason to continue to seek filling that position. And I think I recommended earlier that perhaps it made sense to have an additional, can you scroll that down just a second? So who are the representatives from the contracting party?
To the Chair. So from Canada, it's, and I'm terrible at pronouncing her last name, Estelle Couture. And from your side, we haven't secured a specific individual given recent changes, but it's certainly open to anyone.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, is it the intent that these be people from the fishing industry? Or who?
No, the contracting party representative is meant to be a government official.
Government.
Thank you.
And so I'm sorry, I'm coming back to this a little confused now. What was the impetus for having two NGOs as part of the panel as opposed to no one from the halibut industry itself?
Thank you. Through the Chair. The intention is to have as much as possible an independent peer review of all of the elements of the IPHC's operations. And so by having a contracting party representative, it's more to provide input and guidance from the other panel members on the domestic arrangements that are put in place to support the Commission's operations. Whereas all of the other representatives are meant to be independent of industry, of the government, of the Commission science. Thank you.
Chris?
Thanks for that clarification, Dave. I would certainly be, and I don't know if you need a motion, but I would be certainly in favor of moving forward on this quickly. If you are unable to secure one or two NGO seats in the next week, I would suggest you give up on that and move forward.
Is there a seconder to that?
I'll second that.
So carried. Any any opposition? No.
Thank you, Chair. And before I move on to the next agenda item, I actually see that as a good sign where we're contacting all the NGOs and that I can possibly think of to participate in a performance review of the IPHC, and all of them are indicating that they don't consider us a high priority. I consider that a good sign. The final paper that we have to discuss this morning is under agenda item 14.2, and that's the peer review process for IPHC science products, paper 15. So we'll just project that onto the screen. So you may recall from the interim meeting where we highlighted and provided you with further information based on your request to develop alternative and additional mechanisms to undertake peer review of IPHC scientific products. So paper 15 outlines a little bit of the background of where we are and what we've been doing over the last couple of years in terms of the improvements to the peer review process, which in 2013 resulted in the formation of the Scientific Review Board. We also discussed at the interim meeting some of the difficulties that the Scientific Review Board is now encountering due to the volume and complexity of scientific products that the Commission staff are producing. And so as a result of that, we now have 3 core science streams, which we would like to consider, would like to have you consider for additional supplementary peer review components. Those 3 streams are obviously the stock assessment and associated inputs, and so that includes the space-time modeling of survey data elements. We have the other core project, the management strategy evaluation work that's been ongoing and is due for delivery in January of 2021 for potential implementation as a harvest strategy. And we have the 5-year biological and ecosystem sciences research program, which has been growing day by day, strength by strength, in terms of the complexity and relevance of the science that the IPHC produces in terms of providing you support in the decisions that you need to make at each annual meeting. So it's really a function of the SRB being extended beyond its current capacity that has required us to develop this paper and these alternative mechanisms. Now, to cut to the chase, given you've heard all of this at the interim meeting, for the Stream 3, which is the Biological and Ecosystem Sciences Research Program, we're currently suggesting no changes. And the reason for that is that we have already beefed up the scientific review panel with a geneticist, Dr. Kim Shribner, to undertake additional peer and very specific peer review of those genetic components of the research that Dr. Planas is undertaking. And we have already agreed that should an additional project be undertaken by that group, that we would strengthen the SRB with a further field-specific panelist. And so we're at the moment, we're status quo with that particular stream. That said, with Stream 1, the stock assessment and associated inputs, we have 2 proposals before you. The first is that the SRB shall continue to remain as the primary peer review mechanism on an annual basis for the stock assessment, noting that we undertake annual updates to the data inputs and minor structural changes, and then every number of few years, we undertake a full review and a full stock assessment rather of Pacific halibut, and that's currently scheduled to be undertaken this year. Time's flying. And so as part of that broader periodic improvement to the IPHC stock assessment for Pacific halibut, we're suggesting that, and you have tentatively approved, the need for additional external peer review. And at the interim meeting, you directed us to commence the development of terms of reference and how that would look as external peer reviewer. And as part of that, we are requesting, and you've approved, that the Scientific Review Board should obviously be a participant in developing those terms of reference. Um, Similarly, for the management strategy evaluation process, we believe that and propose that the SRB shall continue again to act as the primary peer review mechanism on an annual basis, noting it meets twice yearly to review not only the Secretariat's work, but also the industry-driven advice coming from the MSAB as an advisory body of the Commission. In addition to that, as you directed us at the interim meeting, we are moving forward with developing terms of reference for an external expert to be hired for a number of short periods throughout 2019 and 20 to undertake a peer review of key elements such as the scale and distribution elements prior to them being released in full to the Commission. Now, again, noting that the SRB is a key component in that element in terms of developing the terms of reference for this peer review mechanism, we have two recommendations for you, which are shown on the screen, to formalize your requests from the interim meeting. And they are that the Commission is recommending that the Secretariat develop terms of reference for a consultant to undertake a peer review of the Commission's stock assessment for implementation in early 2019. And Dr. Stewart is planning to commence the revisions to the stock assessment structure as soon as this meeting ceases, and he will be able to provide that most likely in May to a potential consultant to undertake an initial review of the structure of that model. Secondly, we are recommending that the Secretariat finalize terms of reference. The Commission recommends that the Secretariat finalize terms of reference for an expert or consultant to undertake a peer review of the IPHC management strategy evaluation process for implementation in early November of 2019. So that would be following the two MSAB meetings this year. And then again in July of 2020. So that would be immediately following the MSAB meeting in May of 2020, so that you would have a succinct report from that consultant prior to not only the work meeting, but more importantly, probably the interim meeting, and then subsequently the annual meeting in 2021, where you'll be requested to review the results on scale and distribution, which essentially equates to a harvest strategy for potential adoption and implementation. And with that, Chair, I will take any questions. Thank you.
Any questions on the proposed changes to the peer review? So Dave, you're looking for support from the Commission to adopt this particular paper. Chris?
So moved.
Did you have a question, Bob? Go ahead. Neil did.
So would the SRB be involved in the peer review, or is this someone outside that?
Thank you. Through the chair. The response is it's a parallel process. The SRB would certainly be reviewing the interim and draft reports, but the peer reviewer is external to the recommendations, or rather influence, of the SRB. It would certainly take on board any comments that the SRB may periodically review and provide on, but the consultants would be external to the advice if it deemed appropriate.
I think maybe the table 1 shows that there's there's an overlap, I suppose. You have the stock assessment that's updated with a full assessment, and then it's undertaken, the peer review would be by the Scientific Review Board on an annual basis, and then I guess every 3 years you have an external one undertaken, is what's being proposed. And then you had your proposal for the MSE is a little bit different. I don't see a table for that, but just going back to that, for the MSE, you're proposing to have a peer review, external one in November of 2019 and again in July in 2020. And at this point, for the stream 3, I guess it is, Dave. You're saying at this point there would not be external peer review, but this would be revisited and see if there is a need for that.
Thank you, Chair. And so just to highlight where that indication is in summarized format is Appendix 2 of the document. And we have that flow chart of expected peer reviews by the SRB and then also the external peer reviewers. And just to recall the comments made at the interim meeting where where you indicated you would like the MSE peer review to occur at those periods. And you also noted for the stock assessment peer review, it may not occur on a rigid 3-year basis. It would be determined on an as per needed basis by the Commission. And so it may be longer than those three-year periods. And we retain that flexibility on your guidance. Thank you, Chair.
All right, so we have a motion and a seconder, and Bob, if that addressed your questions, are there any opposition to the motion? No. So that's passed unanimously. Does that conclude? Well, again, we do have an option for public comment and questions. Are there any, Steve? Is there any other business this morning, Dave?
Thank you, Chair. And so at your discretion, it may be worth seeking some clarification from commissioners either in session or offline on some of the suggested edits to the draft report which you received last night. And I suggest that simply because there are some conflicting edits that are being proposed. So we could either do that online or offline at your leisure. Thank you, Chair.
But is there a preference to do it offline or do it now? I'm going to propose that we do it offline. If you send around an updated document that incorporates the changes where that have been provided by the parties, and maybe you can flag where there are differences, and then we can take a look at that and see how we want to deal with it. Is that agreeable?
Thank you, Chair. We'll certainly do that very shortly for you. So that rounds out the agenda for today, noting that we had this afternoon scheduled for commissioners to be able to caucus or to participate as observers in the Processor Advisory Board and Conference Board. Noting that we have accelerated through these items, that leaves the rest of the day open for additional commission activities, but we don't have anything in particular that we need to present to you. Thank you, Chair.
All right, thanks very much. Chris?
I was just uncertain where we left, how we were going to, how and when we would resolve the question on the economist position.
We're going to get together at some point today and we could have a short discussion there. And if there's no change, then it just carries on. Yes, we have. What I was going to propose, Chris, is that right now, what time is it? It's about 10:30 or something. Maybe we just adjourn and we can have a little discussion about how we want to proceed with the rest of the day, what works in your timing and what works in ours. After a health break.
Yes.
So about 10 minutes? 15, okay.